today is similar to the 1930s. Let's look at that. Let's analyze that. First, there are some similarities, some strong similarities. In Europe today, we have two parliamentary parties with significant representation in parliaments. But moreover, they have street militia. We have not seen this since the 1930s and National Socialism. This is totally unique. And there are other anti-Semitic parties in Europe, but none have street militia, essentially brown shirts. Secondly, if you look at what comes out of much of the Middle East, primarily the Middle East, but it comes out of other places, what comes over the internet, it is similar to Der Stürmer. It is the demonization of Jews. It is Jews as cockroaches, Jews as vermin, Jews as rats, Jews as subhuman, some type of humanoid. This is the precursor to violence, and eventually the precursor of genocide. This is not only an anti-Semitism, but other forms of hatred as well. When you dehumanize a human being, that's what the beginning of violence is. Thirdly, we have a country in the world that is committed to killing Jews, Iran, committed to eliminating Israel. And though they don't talk about genocide, they don't talk about killing 6 million, nuclear weapons used against Israel, it'd be exactly that. And finally, we have the greatest recession in world history since the Great Depression. All these are similar factors to the 1930s. But there are differences. First, let us be clear. Iran is a threat, but Iran is not Nazi Germany. Iran is not the greatest military power in the world, despite how difficult that threat is. Secondly, we have refuge for Jews. In the 1930s, there was nowhere to go. Our essentially quota system cut off Jews, and though I think the U.S., we talked about the U.S. record on anti-Semitism, how good it is. In the 1930s, we had very onerous quotas that were put in place between 1921 and 24 to make sure that Jews and Italians and Slavs, Eastern Europeans, did not get into the United States. Very few numbers from places like Russia or Poland. But there were numbers. Guess what? Even those small numbers were not filled because people in the State Department, my State Department, decided they weren't going to get filled. Even Jewish children trying to get out of Germany could not fit into those quotas. And frankly, Germany had higher quotas. We never filled the German quotas until 1939. But today there's places to go. You can get into the United States. You can get into places like the Commonwealth countries like Australia. If you have an EU passport, you can move around the EU. And of course, there's Israel. Another factor, Jews are not defenseless. Israel can defend itself. Israel can defend other Jews around the world. And a final factor, in the 30s, we had, besides the Nazis, many other governments around the world who were anti-Semitic, openly anti-Semitic. We have governments that are very problematic around the world. And now I'm not talking about Iran because I put Iran in a special category. But you don't have anti-Semitic governments. You may have anti-Semites in those governments, but their policies are not fundamentally anti-Semitic. They may not be good policies. They may not be effective policies, but they are not trying to get rid of their Jews in their country, at least openly or in any stated way. So there are similarities and there's differences. So what does that mean? Well, part of it means ambiguity, which is not easy. But part of it is there are some things that we really can't say. Number one, I have not in 6.5 months found one person who has told me anything but that in the last 11 or 12 years, since around 2001, anti-Semitism has not gotten worse. Everybody agrees it has. Everybody. And almost everybody will tell me in almost every country I've visited, but not totally, but most everybody, that since the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, last 5 years roughly, it also has gotten continually worse. Secondly, what this American Jewish community did in the Soviet Jewry movement historically is unbelievable. It really is an amazing thing that was done. And maybe we have to do this again with Jews in Europe. But this time it's not going to be so easy. Last time we had one address we had to go to. It was the Kremlin. This time it's much tougher. There's lots of different addresses, and there's lots of different situations. And though anti-Semitism is really worrisome, really bad in many European countries, they're all different. How so? Well, just one way you could look at it is East versus West, Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. And even within those categories, there are real differences. But let's start easily. In Eastern Europe, we have the highest levels of anti-Semitism. ADL and others have measured these things, and the levels of anti-Semitism, attitudes, what percentage of the population anti-Semitic, are very high in many of these Eastern European countries. Places like Poland, places like Hungary. Western Europe, they're lower. But in Western Europe, Jews fear violence much more, with one good reason. Someone said Muslim population. That is true. It's not just France. More worrisome, we'll talk about it, Belgium, Sweden. Now let's be honest a second. My job is to fight anti-Semitism. But also the State Department, where I'm in, tries to fight all forms of intolerance. And I want to say something here. It may not be popular. Muslims in many of these countries are discriminated against, seriously. But that does not in any way justify violence or hatred of Jews. And that is a problem that has to be confronted by Western European governments if we're going to solve this problem. There's no question. The FRA is the Fundamental Rights Agency. 2 weeks ago, if you haven't seen this and you get access to the internet, see this report. Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union had a report which is mind-blowing. First time I've seen something like this. They interviewed 6,000 Jews in 8 European countries. I think I can get them. UK, France, Belgium, Sweden, Germany, Italy, Hungary, Poland. I think that's it. Latvia. I must have added something wrong. But Latvia isn't. Poland was not in there. Okay, very good. Good. See, I have really smart people in the audience. Correct me. That's great. I'll just give you one piece of data. In Hungary and in France, anti-Semitism manifests itself very differently. But in Hungary, 47% of Jews have thought of immigrating in the last 5 years because of anti-Semitism. 47 or 48. In France, it's 47. It was 1% more in Hungary. In Belgium, 40%. Now, the numbers also on fear of violence, fear of their children being subject to violence, fear of harassment are really astounding. But they're also very different for various different countries. It's interesting how low the United Kingdom is compared to these other countries. And not everything, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, and perhaps in the questions. Let me tell you some other anecdotal things that I've seen that I think are really telling as well. When I was in Belgium, I was really surprised. Jews fear walking the streets with a kippah in Antwerp or in Brussels or with a Magen David. You're going to be harassed. In Belgium, people told me they told their kids in university, don't come back. There's no future for you here. In France, it used to be that the vast majority of French Jewish children went to public schools. Today, 1/3 go to public schools, 1/3 go to Jewish schools, 1/3 go to Catholic schools. The 1/3 in Jewish schools, besides a smaller religious minority, and the 1/3 in Catholic schools are there to protect themselves from violence. harassment in public schools. In the suburbs of France, in the last presentation, people were talking the suburbs. In the suburbs, Jews who don't have the money to get out are moving from one suburb to another so they can be in proximity to each other. So a few suburbs are getting large numbers of Jews because otherwise they don't feel safe in their community. In the suburbs?
In these countries, it's the Muslims.
Well, let's talk about, we can talk about this in a few minutes. In places like France, that's largely true. But let me tell you something else. I go to shul when I go overseas because when I go overseas, I see the embassies set me up with government officials, Jewish community leaders, NGOs, Jewish and non-Jewish, fighting anti-Semitism or other forms of intolerance. But I don't see the man or woman on the street. So going to shul gives me a little bit of better perspective. So the day after Simchas Torah, I went to one shul. Second night, it was Shabbos, and so Friday night, I went to the Grand Synagogue in Paris. And the rabbi graciously invited me to Shabbat dinner afterwards. We walked, this is in central Paris, beautiful neighborhoods. There are no Muslim immigrants in these neighborhoods to any large degree. And we walked, all 3 or 4 of us, a couple congregants came, walked with kippahs from the synagogue, 7 o'clock or so, to the rabbi's house, about maybe 7 or 8 blocks away. Everything's fine, no problem. We have Shabbos dinner. I come down about 11:15 to the street. I'm wearing a kippah. I don't normally wear a kippah, but in rabbi's house, Shabbos dinner, of course I would. I walk onto the street. The head of the synagogue, president of the synagogue, grabs my arm and says, "Take it off, it's not safe." Beautiful neighborhoods in Paris. These are not Muslim neighborhoods. That is scary. And frankly, as I was told, anti-Semitism is more acceptable today in French society, not just among Muslims. You can say, people say things on the internet, people say things on television that they would not have said a decade ago. So finally, let me talk about one other thing. And I don't like to use anti-Semitism when I'm talking about this. Yes, there's anti-Semitism involved, and frankly, yes, there's a lot of Islamophobia involved. But the biggest immediate threat to Jewish communities in Europe is banning circumcision. And related, and I don't think is a fundamental threat the same way, but is also very concerning, is banning kosher slaughter. A year ago in Germany, there was a court case that banned circumcision. The Bundesstaat overturned it. This year, this summer, or actually this early as fall, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe put out a resolution equating female genital mutilation and circumcision. The Norwegian government a few weeks ago said they're going to put new regulations on circumcision as of April 20th or before. And finally, in the last few weeks, 5 representatives of Scandinavian governments, each of these are called children's ombudsmen, children's rights advocates, from Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, all signed a letter saying there is absolutely no reason, medical reasons, for male circumcision, and that it should be banned outright. The Norwegian children's ombudsman said, if only Muslims and Jews were educated about the barbarity of this, they would stop it. This is a real problem. I look at a community like Hungary with 100, 110,000, 120,000 Jews, with a core of the community, maybe 10 or 20,000, the people who are most active in the shuls, who are most active in the organizations, etc. We ban circumcision in a country like that, people are going to leave very quickly. They're already thinking of leaving. They would leave. And when you do that, you hollow out the center of a community and you kill the community. Now, I don't know what many Europeans feel about this, but I can tell you, for us in the US government, we feel this will be a huge problem, not just for the Jewish community. It is a huge problem for Europe. Europe will be losing communities that are 2,000, in some cases 2,200 years old. Even Poland, which has deep anti-Semitism, you can't help but notice in Poland how many people will come up to you and say, by losing our Jewish community, we lost a huge piece of our culture. We are poor for it. And we're finding in the Middle East that we're having monocultures. Jews were forced out in 48 and 67, 70. And now Christian communities are being forced out. They are going to be much poorer for that. And Europe will be poor if this happens. So the consequences. First off, consequences of what's happening in Europe. I don't think tomorrow we're facing the end of Jewish communities. People are thinking of leaving. It takes a lot to leave. A new language, a new profession, a new country is very difficult. And French Jews and others have told me it has to get worse. But the trend line is worse. Doesn't mean it will, but the trend line so far is worse. But first, if things continue, there will be loss of life. How many of you have heard about Toulouse, of what happened in Toulouse last year? I was at a Jewish community. I'm going to end this real quick because I want to have some time for questions. I'm going to actually stop on this. Let me say what can be done. I do not know what the full strategy should be done. I know the United States has got to speak out, and it's important that it's not just me, but it's people above me, whether it's assistant secretaries, deputy secretaries, the Secretary of State who has spoken out, the president who has spoken out. But the more we have those people involved, the more effective this message will be. On the issue of circumcision, we have to be out front now. We can't, no country is going to ban circumcision in the near future. But public opinion is such in Europe that it's critical, and we are not going to attack this as anti-Semitism. We're going to attack it as religious freedom. And religious freedom has to be maintained. The United States will fight for religious freedom across the world. The other piece is the American Jewish community has to be mobilized. And it's not as easy as the Soviet Jewry movement. It's much more complex, it's much more ambiguous, but it is a threat, just like the threats to Israel. And I ask all of you to, as you get involved in your organizations, you be thinking about this, and I would like to collaborate. As a U.S. government representative, I can never tell you what to do, but we can talk together and figure out what's the United States government role and what can be the Jewish community's role. And frankly, if this is going to be combated, we're going to need the help of others. People like Pope Francis, who already is, in what he's written before he became Pope and what he's saying now, is a great ally in the fight against anti-Semitism. We also need the people like who I saw on the first day of my job. I was sworn in on May 20th about 8:30 a.m. At 4 o'clock, I was on a plane to Warsaw where I met up with about a dozen imams and Islamic scholars who were visiting Dachau and Auschwitz. I was frankly a little skeptical. But what came out of that was very powerful and a very strong need on their part to go back to their communities and talk about the evil of Holocaust denial and the evil of anti-Semitism. We'll need allies like that. Okay, so what we said before, if you look at anti-Semitism around the world, one of the things you know is long after I'm gone from this job, which will be 3 years, long after I'm dead, long after all of our grandchildren in this room are dead, anti-Semitism will exist. There's no doubt about it. The question is, what can we do to make it less in the future? And when you realize that, it can be pretty depressing. That no matter what we do, it will be here. But what I take a little comfort is one of our great Jewish sages, Rabbi Tarfon, who, I'll paraphrase it, we are not required to finish the task, but neither are we exempt from starting it. And even more for me is this type of work, and I hope for you as well, is summed up, and the importance of it is summed up by another phrase by Rabbi Tarfon, which is, the day is short, the work is much, The workers are lazy. The reward is great. And the master is insistent. Thank you. So let's have some questions.
Okay, if everyone can go back, oh, that's not working, to the microphone here, and we'll ask questions based on the line behind the microphone.
And I'm going to apologize. I have to walk out of here in about 15 minutes just to catch a train back to Washington. I'm sorry that we don't have more time. I apologize.
Ira, first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for taking the time last week from your busy schedule to meet with me at the State Department regarding the anti-Semitic attacks that are occurring on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. Thank you very much for that. And also thank you very much for evincing the concern around this issue that you did. My question involves a report that I read last week that the FRA has scrubbed from its website the EUMC working definition on anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And number one, about the veracity of that report.
No, let's do one.
And
Yeah,
the State Department has also stepped back from the EUMC working definition. Are these reports true? And if so, what do you believe the implications are of that? I believe it's a very good working definition.
Yeah, the working definition, as I understand it, is approximately what I described. Delegitimization, defamation, double standard. And it has been what's called a working definition on their websites for a while. And it is true they took it down, and they basically, one spokesman from FRA said that it's never been a formal official. It has not changed in the State Department, unless someone changed it and didn't tell me. But I don't think that's happened. I know it's not happened. And we would fight, certainly, any changes on, and I don't see any changes in the U.S. definition. It's an excellent question. I think I need to talk to some of my colleagues in the community and talk about how we address this. One of the things I fight all the time, and I want to be very frank about that, there's a lot of things we need to do, some of which I can't do alone. I have to get permission within the State Department. But also, one of the things we do all the time is what we call triage. You have limited, even with the U.S. government behind you, we have limited resources, limited money, limited people. How many fights can we take on? You have to take on the most important, the most critical, and you can't take them all on. And there are fights on every front. I'll give you a classic example. We're going to be doing some things on, and we've already done some things on kosher slaughter. Real important, but I've got to make it secondary to circumcision, because the threat circumcision cause is much more direct, at least in the near future. So I'd be happy to talk to you further and talk to other people in the community and see what people are thinking about what we can do and how efficacious that would be versus some other things we need to do.
Ira, if I could just make one quick announcement. We are going to keep working through the next 15-minute break, so anyone who wants coffee or a snack should go out and come back in. We're going to keep on rolling. And I'll also ask questioners, because of Ira's limited time, to really both ask questions and to keep the questions moving.
Thank you for your presentation. I think everyone in this room is concerned not just, is it on?
Yeah, no, you're fine.
Not just radical Islam, the growth of parties like Golden Dawn and the Jobbik Party,
yes.
but bringing this home. You said if things ever get so bad, there is always a place for Jews here. A few years ago, I met a group of lovely French Jewish students that said they would love to come here. Their parents were accountants and physicians. They said it's very, very hard for them to become naturalized citizens. I walk down street corners, I see unskilled laborers from third world countries, Yemen, Sudan, Egypt, Pakistan, unskilled, street vendors everywhere. I see this now in the schools, in our neighborhoods. So I would like to know, I realize it's not a State Department issue. The reality is, when you talk about these groups being able to come here, I see no evidence of that. If you could comment on that.
What I'll comment on is the ability of Jews and others to get into the country today is dramatically better than it was in the 30s and 40s. And if you are a refugee for political reasons or religious discrimination, there are refugee statuses. That doesn't mean every person can get into this country, and they don't, frankly. And in terms of your questions about third world folks, this is not my area. And if I get in areas that are not my area, I will be much less effective in fighting anti-Semitism. I have to focus laser-like. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Over the years, the State Department had a reputation of being Arabist in bent.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, and I hope I don't put you on a spot because you're an employee, whether that's still true, especially under this administration.
Yeah. So what I just said about staying in my area, I think is really important. So I don't do Middle East policy. I do not do, for example, a host of other things other than anti-Semitism. We speak out once in a while on other issues where we have allies who are helping us. So we may speak out, for example, Christians being persecuted in the Middle East. But only I can tell you anecdotally is, first off, I was at AIPAC in the 70s and 80s. And I think everything I see of this State Department is a very different State Department than what I saw in the 70s and 80s. It is, the State Department used to be a domain of white Anglo-Saxon males from 4 universities like Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Columbia. It is very diverse. I do not see in my day-to-day work signs of Arabism, or that type of what we would call what you were referring to. Now, it is true in the NEA Bureau that there are some 20-some Arab assignments. There's one Israel assignment. That's always been the case, and that has its own built-in bias because people who work in a given country have a tendency, especially if they're in what are called regional bureaus like EUR Bureau, et cetera, they have a tendency to support their country because they want good relations to the United States and their country. Not everybody's like that, but there is some tendency of that. But to the larger question you're saying, I don't want to answer that truly in the sense that I have a good handle on it. I don't. It's not my area. But I can tell you dramatically, to the degree that statement was largely true, it's no matter what I know or don't know, it's much, much less true today, or even 5 years or 10 years ago than it was 30, 40 years ago. No question.
Okay, thank you.
Mindy, before you go, I have to say that this is unfortunately the last question, and apologies to all the people further back in line. After Mindy asks her question and Ira answers, maybe there'll be a few minutes in the back to grab Ira and talk, but I'd ask everyone to be respectful of Ira's travel plans.
No manhandling, please.
Okay.
Yes, Mindy.
Just a few minutes earlier, we were speaking about one of the best ways to fight anti-Semitism is to start early with education in the schools.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is what you are doing with education here in America and, very importantly, in Europe, and also I would include the mosques in that. What is actually being done that we can actually practically do something?
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation and also at the Conference of Presidents when I met with you. You were great.
Thank you. Thank you
for the work.
very much. One of the frustrations in this job is asking people what are best practices. As I mentioned before, we have limited resources. My time's limited. My staff's time's limited. Our dollars are limited. So you want to do what's most effective. No one can tell me this is the best way to do it. Now, what I can tell you is this. Every person in this job, and there have been 3 of us, one in the Bush administration and and that was Greg Rickman, and then Hannah Rosenthal, who preceded me in the Obama administration. Each of us are able to, in some ways, craft what we're supposed to do. How do we think we can best combat? And with not best practices, it isn't always unanimous. But my conception of this job, at least so far, is my first responsibility is to relieve the pressure on Jewish communities who are today. That's my first priority.
I'm not going to ask a question.
My second priority is what do we do to invest in the future? That's exactly this issue. What kind of education, what type of training, what type of things can we do to tamp down the anti-Semitism of the future? And particularly, I want to say, much of this is coming out on the internet and much of this is coming out of the Middle East. The irony is a place where there are no Jews is exporting hate often back into Europe, whereas in the 19th and early 20th century, anti-Semitism was exported from Europe around the world. Now it's being exported back. What do we do to tamp that down? We're not going to stop it. What can we do to make it less? Education, I think, is obviously a big piece of that. It's not the only piece of it. How we deal with the internet is going to be a big piece of it. We have some programs at State Department which we fund, which does education. We're doing one, I know, in Latin America right now. We're doing one in Europe right now to funding education. We did one, a separate one the year before. We continue to fund those types of programs. But frankly, our numbers are a lot of the work is being done by, and what makes me most optimistic, this is not a job to be optimistic in, so I don't want to go too far. But when I travel around Europe and see these young people, Jews, non-Jews, Christians, non-believers, even Muslims, in Oslo, the head of the anti-racist NGO was a young Muslim man who knew more about anti-Semitism than anybody I talked to in the Jewish community and knew exactly how he had to fight it in his own community. It was inspiring that this guy was committed part of his life to fighting anti-Semitism. And I saw it in France with young Jews and organizations with Muslims and Christians and non-believers. Those are some of the things, if we have those people, if we can nurture those people on the ground, and they're young people, that may be one of our best tools of all.